The honourable member for Stormont Dundas South Glengarry.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. After 8 years of this Prime Minister, Canada is not as safe these days. 8 years later, Madam Speaker, Canadians know that, they feel that, and they hear example after example of that fear right at home. Don't take my word for it. Canadians can share, sadly, many personal examples of that. But I want to start in my comments by framing the context of why we have this bill before us in Parliament again. Earlier this summer, the government's own numbers agency, Stats Canada, released some staggering numbers that just show how bad the crime wave in Canada is after 8 years of this NDP Liberal government. They summarize a scary national breakdown of public safety in this country. For an increase in occurrences of crime since 2015, total violent crimes up 39%. Homicides are up 43%, up for the 4th year in a row. Gang-related homicides up 108%. Violent gun crimes up 101%, up every single year this Prime Minister has been in office. Aggravated assaults up 24%. Assault with a weapon or bodily harm up 61%. Total sexual assaults up 71%. Sex crimes against children up 126%. Kidnappings up 36%. Car theft up 34%. And when they look at the Violent Crime Severity Index, under the previous Conservative government, it decreased by nearly 25%. It has gone under this Prime Minister in his NDP Liberal government in the total opposite direction. We can do a regional breakdown. And Madam Speaker, I'm taking the time to put this data from Stats Canada into the record for a specific reason. In the City of Toronto, the total number of violent criminal code violations increased to 57,896 in 2022. That is a 30% increase since 2015. Homicides are up in 8 years, up 65.85%. And in Toronto, violent firearms offences increased to 655 in 2022. That's an increase of 64%. Last year, 44 murders were committed with a firearm in Toronto. 24 of those was by someone who was out on bail. City of Winnipeg, total number of violent criminal code violations increased to over 14,000, a 48.5% increase in 8 years. Homicides increased by 136% in the City of Winnipeg. You go to Calgary, violent criminal code violations increased to nearly 16,000 last year, a 40% increase over 8 years since this Prime Minister came into office. Violent firearms offences increased by 428% in Calgary. Go a little bit further to Edmonton. Violent firearms offences increased by 97%. Go a little further west to Vancouver. Violent criminal code violations increased to nearly 32,000 in 2022. That's a 22.5% increase since the Prime Minister and the NDP Liberal government took office. Homicides up 55% in Vancouver, and violent firearms offences up 22% in that city alone. And coming back here to the nation's capital, the Ottawa-Gatineau region, violent crime just shy of 14,000, a 37.1% increase in 8 years. Homicide increases in the nation's capital, up 112%. Violent firearms offenses increased by 115%. That is the situation after 8 years of this Prime Minister and their soft on-crime policies. That is the record that they sadly own. Just over my shoulder behind me is my colleague from Swan River in rural Manitoba. I've highlighted the stats of many of our major cities. Rural crime is also out of control, Madam Speaker. My colleague has raised, I think, at least a couple of dozen times, I've heard him multiple times, tabling petitions in this House from Canadians begging this Prime Minister to understand the public safety threat and the crime wave that's been unleashed in this country because of their policies, to little or no avail. And this is the thing that is so frustrating for Canadians, Madam Speaker. The Prime Minister is the best at photo ops. He loves selfies. He loves making announcements about the things he will do and how great. It's never been so good for Canadians, is what you'll hear him talk about often. But anytime the going gets tough, anytime you read the data and statistics like I just did, the Prime Minister heads for the hills, goes up to the cottage, refuses to answer questions, and I've never, in my 36 years of life, seen somebody skirt from accountability based on their own record. It's always somebody else's fault. You watch debate in this House, you watch question period, you never see this government take an ounce of responsibility for the problems in this country. They'll blame the provinces, they'll talk about law enforcement, they'll talk about everything else except what they are actually responsible for and their policies that are doing this to every part of this country. Canadians, when we look at this, you see Bill C-48 that's before us, and I'll get to that specifically. But it's important for Canadians and for this House to be reminded, and for the Liberals and the NDP to be humbled as to why we are talking about Bill C-48. It all emanates from an idea they had less than 5 years ago with a Bill C-75 that made significant, major, and wrong reforms to the bail process in Canada. It was passed in 2019, and it legislated a principle of restraint, is what they called it, concerning bail for police and courts to ensure that release at the earliest opportunity is favored over detention. Bail by default is a simple way of explaining this, Madam Speaker. And make no mistake about it, why I read all those comments into the record about the severity of public safety in this country, felt by millions and millions of Canadians in their communities, is not by some random chance, not by some phenomenon that just came along. It's because the Prime Minister has passed Bill C-75 and wrecked our bail reform process. A revolving door of bail is happening in every part of this country. Now, with this bill, they've admitted, after immense pressure by Conservatives, by premiers of all parties in every province and territorial leaders, and law enforcement officials who are working on the front lines of this crisis day in and day out. They were pulled and they were forced to make this change and backtrack on their soft on-crime policies. But let me make it clear, Madam Speaker, of this. This is only one small step of what needs to happen when it comes to bail reform in this country. They've gone back an inch. They need to go back a heck of a lot further to solve the problem that we face. And it's simple. You've heard us say before, jail, not bail, for repeat violent offenders. And all nip this in the bud, as they call it, right off the bat, Madam Speaker. The Liberals always go and say, well, people make mistakes. Now, I'm not perfect. I've made some mistakes. We all have. Believe it or not, I'm human. Canadians do. But Canadians are equally concerned and frustrated that if someone is charged, convicted, and they are a repeat violent offender, all those crime stats I just talked about, Madam Speaker, they're seeing law enforcement extremely frustrated because someone gets arrested, they go in, and within a day or so, they're out on bail. And we are actually seeing a correlation. They are law enforcement, the statistics are showing that repeat violent offenders are out causing chaos. They're causing numerous police interactions by the thousands. When not on the first chance or a bad thing, we're not talking about a speeding ticket or a small amount of substance or even a first offense. It's repeat violent offenders. And Canadians are getting tired of the revolving door. Our law enforcement are demoralized at how this government is ignoring the very valid concerns that they are raising. The Vancouver Police Union had an unbelievable statistic. I had to say this probably 2 or 3 times and reread it to make sure that, just to comprehend the magnitude of how broken the bail system has become under Liberals and NDP. The Vancouver Police Union said that the same 40 offenders last year had 6,000 police interactions in 1 year. Just think of the resources of the revolving door over and over and over again. Deferring police resources to keeping our community safe 6,000 times on the same 40 people. That is insane. That, Madam Speaker, is a broken Liberal soft-on crime policy. And the frustrating part about all this is that the Liberals still don't get it. This bill goes nowhere near far enough to reverse the damage that they've done and the public safety crisis, the crime wave that they've unleashed across this country. The Prime Minister is in trouble. He was in trouble back in the summer. He desperately wanted to reset things. He's down in the polls, and after 8 years, Canadians realize he's just not worth the cost, he's just not worth the corruption, and he's just not worth the lack of safety we have in this country anymore. So he shuffled his cabinet. A few people announced their retirements. They went to the back benches, to the side benches. New, fresh faces came into cabinet. Well, there was a new justice minister that I'm going to guess on the very first day after visiting Rideau Hall and heading to the Department of Justice for a briefing, I'm going to guess he got a summary about the same Stats Canada data that I just read. And you know what? First opportunity wasn't a full reversal on the failed Bill C-75. One of the first points of the flash forward of this new justice minister was to go on CBC of all places for an interview. And when he was confronted about those stats and how devastating and the rapid increase of violent crime in this country, his response to Canadians was, it's all in their head. The line, when you look at it, it was empirically unlikely that Canada has gotten less safe. That's the reset. That's the new justice minister advocating for public safety in this country. Just in Canadians' heads. Just things you hear about on TV. Out of touch, Madam Speaker. And that's what we have time and time again with the government's approach to bills like C-48. Premiers, law enforcement, and millions of Canadians that have become victims of crime and or know somebody that has become a victim of crime are saying enough is enough. The Justice Minister gave a slap in the face, I think, to victims of crime. to have the Prime Minister double down, denying just how bad the public safety crisis in this country is at this point, just shows you where they're starting from. The Liberals, frankly, should be embarrassed about Bill C-48 because they are admitting that their approach in the previous bills that they introduced were absolutely wrong. They've backtracked. And as I said before, Madam Speaker, Conservatives have been clear. This does not go far enough to the revolving door of bail in this country. And the only reason this bill is before is because of the effort of Conservative members of Parliament at committee, of provincial premiers that were united against this federal government, against this Prime Minister, and for the courageous frontline law enforcement in every part of this country that have had enough. We owe it to them, Madam Speaker, not just to pass Bill C-48, but to do the full fix to protect our law enforcement and protect Canadians and keep people safe. This bill is an admission of failure by the Liberals and NDP. It's an admission that they were soft on crime, and it is proof that they are failing Canadians in keeping them safe. I want to highlight the months of testimony that was heard at the Justice Committee on Canada's broken bail system. There were many key points raised that need to be brought in to the debate that we're having here on the floor. Comprehensive bail reform is urgent. Repeat and violent offenders are becoming a bigger problem for law enforcement. The public's right to be protected against violent, repeat offenders must outweigh the violent, repeat offenders' right to bail. That, Madam Speaker, as we would say, is common sense. There is agreement from numerous individuals that testified with a background in law enforcement and public safety that Bill C-75 has failed to help victims of intimate violence. The current bail system now has put frontline officers at risk, and the Liberals, with their efforts, have sadly eroded the integrity of Canada's bail system. Judges have to apply the criminal code as written, and now people who pose a risk to public safety are too often receiving bail. And the current government is sending the wrong message to Canadians. It was only after all of this pressure, whether it be at the Justice Committee, whether it be in question period, whether it be the letter that the premiers signed, whether it was numerous police unions, chiefs of police associations, provincially and nationally, and most importantly, the devastating stories from way too many Canadians about how they become victims of crime, and in living in neighborhoods where for generations, for decades, they felt safe in their hamlet, their subdivision, their community, their small town, where that has been eroded. It's important in these debates to humanize what's going on here. And a sad part of what's not in Bill C-48 is the devastating and sad story of only a few months ago of OPP Constable Gregory Pirchala. His killer was out on bail. And we've heard and now know that based on this bill and the small fix, not the full fix, a partial fix, that individual would still be out on bail, Madam Speaker. It is extremely frustrating. The list goes on of media story after media story that highlight the crisis we're in. It was the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police that begged for an urgent meeting among premiers, among national leaders to get this. It's not going the full way that they've been asking for. They say easy bail policies make much, quote, much of our work pointless. The chiefs of police are saying about the Liberals' legislative record. on justice and public safety. It was the BC Urban Mayors Caucus that compiled data showing more than 11,000 negative police contacts by just 204 offenders who, quote, rarely faced any consequences for their criminality. I mentioned before about the Vancouver Police Union. The police in Vancouver themselves released data on its 44 most recent stranger attacks suspects, showing that 78% of them had already been charged in a previous criminal incident. Most notably, the law requires that the top priority in any bail hearing is, quote, releasing the accused at the earliest reasonable opportunity and on the least onerous conditions. That has got to change. Again, jail, not bail, for repeat violent offenders must be the goal of this government. After 8 years, Canadians cannot afford any more of this nonsense from the Liberals and propped up every step of the way by the NDP. I want to end my comments tonight, Madam Speaker, with a thought of reflection on where we're at when it comes to the priorities of public safety of this Liberal government, of this Prime Minister. I want to talk about the benefit of the doubt and have Canadians reflect on something. It tells you everything you need to know about the broken approach that they have and the contrast on this side of the aisle with Conservatives that could not be more clear. On bail reform, with Bill C-75 in the Liberals' legislative record, they want to give the principle of restraint, the least onerous bail conditions, give those that are accused the benefit of the doubt, that they should get out on bail. And even if over and over and over again they're being arrested and they're being charged or they're having police interactions, by default, by benefit of the doubt, they get out that way. The result has been a crime wave, a skyrocketing number by Stats Canada of where we're at in this country. And on contrast, when we talk about benefit of the doubt, Madam Speaker, what's their solutions in their mind to fix the problem? Taking away hunting rifles and going after law-abiding hunters and farmers in Indigenous communities, sport shooters alike. There is zero benefit of the doubt for those who are law-abiding, that have their PAL, that have a criminal record check, that have never had an issue or an interaction with police whatsoever. The Liberals and this Prime Minister doesn't think they deserve any benefit of the doubt, and they just want to confiscate and spend billions and billions and billions, not spend, waste, going after Canadians who are of no concern in public safety. That benefit of the doubt, Madam Speaker, tells you everything you need to know about this Prime Minister. There's no common sense there. It's time not just to pass Bill C-48, that small fraction of a solution, but do the right thing. Do it for Canadians that are tired of either being or hearing of a neighbor or a friend or a co-worker being a victim of crime. Do it for the frontline law enforcement in this country that deserve the resources to keep repeat violent offenders behind bars. Jail, not bail, for repeat violent offenders. It is time in this country for common sense. It's time for a real plan for public safety, and it's time for this Prime Minister to put a little water in his wine, have a little humility, listen to premiers, listen to law enforcement. Change not only with Bill C-48, do the full fix that this country needs to be protected. Thank you, Madam Speaker.